Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Catherine Fleming Bruce. I am with T-Noves of Global Commons in Columbia, South Carolina. And today is January 6, 2022. So we have joined with a number of organizations around the country that are contemplating the incident that happened at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. And we have a series of events today, but the event that you're in now, I'm very excited about and very happy that the folks here were able to join us and give us their reflections on that event. So just want to give you a little introduction. Our first person here is Todd Shaw, and we're not going in alphabetical order. Todd Shaw is the former chair and current associate professor at the political science department at the University of South Carolina. He is also author of a book called After Obama, African American Politics in the Post-Obama Era. To give you a little bit more about him, he's published in the Journal of Politics, the National Political Science Review, the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, Politics, Groups, and Identities, and Urban Affairs Review, as well as edited chapters in other journals. He's frequently asked to comment with the media. He's commented with the Grio and the Conversation and the New York Times as well. So thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Shaw. Next, we have Dr. Tyler Parry, and he is our cross-country person. He's at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. So thank you so much for joining us. He is an expert on colonization of the Americas, the African diaspora, and the historical memory of slavery in the United States. And his work has been published in a number of our journals, including American Studies, Journal of Global Slavery, Black Perspectives, and the Washington Post. So thank you so much, Dr. Parry, for joining us. And finally, we have Dr. Robert Greene, right here in Columbia, in South Carolina. He's assistant professor of history at Claflin University in Orangeburg. He and Dr. Parry are co-editors of Invisible No More, the African American Experience at the University of South Carolina, which is really racing up the charts, guys, I must say. It came out #1 on Amazon recently. So we are really thrilled about the reception to this book. Dr. Greene is also published in The Nation, in Dissent, in Current Affairs, and Jacobin as well. His research interests are African American history, African American intellectual history since 1945. He's a blogger and book reviewer for the Society of U.S. Intellectual Historians as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Greene, for giving us your time today on the subject. So we want to start with you, Dr. Greene, to give us, oh, and I should say one other thing. We're going to each talk for about 5 minutes, and then we'll be open to questions from any of you. So please put your questions, those who are viewing today, please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will respond to them so that we can have a good engagement here. And we'll go for about an hour. So thank you so much. Dr. Greene, let's have your opening thoughts.
Well, thank you so much for having me this afternoon. And I'm really pleased to be part of such an illustrious panel of experts and historians and political scientists to talk about what truly is an important day in our nation's history. Now, normally the January 6th following a national presidential election is a ho-hum day in national politics. It's the day where Congress convenes and they count the votes for electoral college and they just go from there. It's largely been considered a ceremonial event. I can recall growing up and watching it just with some muted interest in the 90s and early 2000s, just to see Congress tally up the votes and to formalize the election of the next president of the United States. But last year, in the days and weeks leading up to January 6th, there was something different in the air. People looking back now at places like NPR, the Washington Post, New York Times, and elsewhere have all commented on the fact that in the days and weeks leading up to January 6th, 2021, if you looked at social media, especially on the American right wing, there was a considerable focus on mobilizing for January 6th. There was an idea in the air that the election of 2020 had somehow been stolen from Donald Trump and had been given to Joe Biden. Now, every 4 years or so, there's rhetoric in the air about how the election was stolen, how the wrong people won, so on and so forth. But this time it was a bit different. The president himself was indulging these conspiracy theories and was actually pushing the idea that they had to, quote unquote, stop the steal. And so what we saw on January 6th of last year was truly, I would say, at least on the national level, I stress national level here, an unprecedented effort to use violence to overturn a presidential election. The images that people around the world saw were riveting, they were stunning. A buddy of mine who lives in Uruguay actually called me last year and just to check on me to see what was going on because he couldn't believe what he was seeing himself. But I think what we've seen in the years since then is that many journalists, scholars, and others have come to realize that what happened on January 6th wasn't simply born out of the events of that day or the weeks or months or even the year beforehand. Instead, what we saw on January 6th was a culmination of generations of extreme right wing animosity towards democracy, towards any attempts to overturn white supremacy, towards any attempts to really create what we call a more perfect union. Instead, what January 6th very much was America's worst impulses on national display. Now, I know that today we're going to talk a bit about the South Carolina connections to this event. And this is what I want to talk about just briefly when I say that we hadn't seen violence before on a national scale. Of course, many historians and political scientists have pointed out, and I'm sure my colleagues will say more about this, that during the Reconstruction period, we saw similar scenes like this at Southern state capitals. We saw various attempts by groups and organizations to overturn state and local elections throughout the South in the 1860s and 1870s. But what I think January 6th should also remind us of is that our democracy is incredibly fragile. And if you really think about multiracial democracy, and a genuine multiracial democracy, that idea, that reality is less than 60 years old if you're going back to just the Voting Rights Act going forward. And I think what January 6th shows is that these ideas are not only under siege, but they are perilously close to being lost permanently.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Parry, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Yeah, it's always some regret to go after Dr. Greene and follow him, but I will try to expound upon those points. So Reconstruction was mentioned, which when I was asked to be on this panel was the first thing that came to mind. And it's a period that's been on my mind for the past few years in how much it reflects the current moment and how much I think that if Americans collectively had studied that period enough, I think we would understand and have a lot more historical context to explain what bubbles up to produce something like January 6th of last year. Because even down to the point where beyond the violence of overtaking a capital physically, but the ways under which right-wing historians or scholarship or revisionism will try to brush away the events of what happened on January 6th. So for those that have read some of my Washington Post articles, one thing that is a pretty common theme is I'm kind of writing against right-wing revisionist narratives. And one thing that I've noticed over the past year is if you listen to what you might call conservative talk radio or conservative podcasts, is that they have completely ignored the actual violence of the state capitol. And there are some that condemn it appropriately, but you will often hear people saying, well, there wasn't a significant amount of casualties, or there wasn't a lot of violence. You see photos of the rails, just people being let in and peacefully walking through the Capitol, but they ignore the assaults upon police officers. They ignore the shouting. They ignore the cursing, the vulgarity of the entire process. They ignore the documentaries that have been produced that explicitly show people shouting for the heads of congressional representatives. And in my mind, as kind of a person who studies Reconstruction, I'm thinking of what are called the Redeemer narratives, so-called, that happened after Reconstruction is toppled by both state and federal governments, and how they will simply just brush away the violence that occurred in forbidding people of African descent to cast a vote after 1876. And the methods that were used to subvert people entering into the democratic process. And so for me, what I imagine historians doing in the next 10, 20, 50 years is looking at this moment for not just what happened on January 6th, but the aftermath of January 6th, and how we're seeing this process of historical revisionism on one side of the political aisle being reintroduced in a way that it's been done over and over and over again in American history. And so I appeal to people to study these periods of the 19th century, particularly after about 1868, to try to understand exactly what's going on. And we can use these as tools to further understand how to combat misinformation that is surely going to be coming for the next multiple decades.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And now we're going to bat to Dr. Shaw and our political look.
Well, I am always reminded that it is good to know historians because they can lay the groundwork and for often what we as political scientists try and pull apart as well. So we're in a similar field, just using slightly different tools. Thank you for inviting me on this panel. I want to answer the question about the significance of January 6th and the South Carolina connection by reminding everyone of a small former, I'll put it in finger quotes, insurrection that happened on the floor of the Capitol during President Obama's address to the nation, if I'm not mistaken, around November 2009, when South Carolina Representative Joe Wilson, who was in adamant opposition and from the opposition party to the president, yelled out and exclaimed, "You lie," in the middle of the president's remarks. Now, the reason why I bring that up, of course, is the South Carolina connection, and we can talk about the ways in which South Carolina has played a particular role in questions of insurrection in the nation. But is that I was listening to President Biden's remarks today, which he very forcefully laid the blame for what happened on January 6th at the feet of the former president, President Trump, and his supporters multiple times. One remark he did make about the truth setting us free, which I agree, is that we have to do things so that we state the facts of the case. But he did reference sort of like, I don't understand today's Republican Party. It's not the party of Reagan or of the Bushes. Well, to be honest, the Republican sort of polarization or the partisan polarization that has occurred in part during that era when Reagan, not simply when Reagan became president, but certainly President Reagan, then the Bushes and sort of successors sort of didn't create it or began that process of polarized divide in the nation, so that we as political scientists now talk about this notion of effective polarization. And the only reason I bring this up is that now we're at where you can have wide swaths of Americans, and particularly as divided by party, see the same event and reach entirely different conclusions. whether it is the efficacy of wearing masks, the efficacy of vaccines, the fact that we are we or are we not in a pandemic, to what happened on January 6th, that Republicans and Democrats now see these events through entirely different lenses. Effective polarization says in effect that we're not seeing these through different lenses simply because of policy divides. It's now around to the fact of identity divides. As Ezra Klein, but many other political scientists have said, that now to be a Republican and to be a Democrat in this nation, and thus to interpret what happened on January 6th, is to come from entirely different social sets, whether it be race, whether it be religion, whether it be, and not just political ideology. Now, the reason I mention that is that that I also have other colleagues in political science who have looked at this question around these divides and the interpretation of facts from partisan standpoint, and have concluded that race is a major driver, that racial polarization drives our political polarization and our effective polarization, to the degree to which the parties in some respects have become sort of these, well, let's just state it plainly. The Democratic Party has become the party of folk who are leaning to the left, but from a racial and ethnic standpoint, more predominantly racial and ethnic minorities, African Americans in particular. And the Republican Party is the conservative party, clearly, but it is a more predominantly white party. And so in all these ways, I want to just sort of raise that question as a slight correction to what President Biden says, that this polarization didn't just occur. It has been here and has grown at least since the late 70s. I'll stop my comments there.
Okay, thank you so much. Now let me ask this of all of you when we talk about polarization. Do you think that there's been any connection between the explosion of digital channels from the time in which we had 4 or 5 channels on television that everyone was watching and kind of coming away with a similar interpretation, to now we have hundreds of channels available through broadcast, through digital broadcasts, and we also have the internet, which has a lot of other portals. So in addition to the polarization by identity, do you think we also have a communications based polarization?
I think that's actually a really important point for all of us to consider. Going back for a second and taking your point, running with it, if we look at the history of American media, the idea of a nonpartisan media, of a media that is responsive to everyone, is actually an outlier in US history. When we think of the responsible journalists, think of a Walter Cronkite. We think of the 6:30 evening news, right? We think of that as the place to go to for reliable news and information. And when Walter Cronkite said something, for example, when he said the war in Vietnam can't be won in 1968, people stopped and paid attention. But for most of American history, our media has been incredibly polarized. You can go back, for example, to the late 18th century. You see newspapers calling Thomas Jefferson and John Adams everything but children of God, basically. Or you know, the Reconstruction period, and papers were heavily polarized. I know Tyler can tell you about reading stories, newspapers that paint Republicans and Democrats in that era in very malicious light. But I think what we're seeing now is not only a reversion to that kind of journalism that is very polarized, but like you said, the fact that it's almost everywhere now, it's basically our entire media landscape makes it all the more dangerous. And I want to look especially at the conservative media landscape for a brief moment, because I think that has become often wrapped up in 2 words, Fox News. But I think that's a mistake. Because if you look at the conservative media landscape now, it is far more variegated than it was even 10 years ago. Because today you not only have Fox News, you have One America News Network, you have various Twitter accounts. And if you look at what these different conservative media outlets are doing in relation to January 6th, they are all playing what Tyler mentioned a moment ago, a pivotal role in shaping the the memory of these events for the right wing and saying that either A, they weren't that big of a deal, or B, which is more worrisome, they're saying actually what happened on January 6th was a good thing. And it's only a prelude to fighting to stop the steal, quote unquote. You're seeing both of these narratives in the right wing press today. But I think your point about the media landscape is incredibly important because it plays a role in not only the politics of today, but also the memory of what happened on this day 1 year ago.
Correct, correct. And I'm also thinking about democratic institutions. So what are your thoughts on the implication of January 6th on the strength and security of our democratic institutions? Or perhaps maybe they were never strong and that was just an illusion, and we need to wake up from that idea.
Well,
so anyone?
I think I saw Tyler on mic. I'll let him go because I think it was the prior question, but I will answer this one as well.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thanks, Todd. Yeah, just really quickly, building off something that Robert said and what Todd had said earlier, is that it's hard to deny that there's a new form of media that has introduced something that is unprecedented, though it's building upon what I think historians would argue has always been very polarized. You can read various newspapers from the Reconstruction period, 19th century, and come away with two very different interpretations of what was going on. And that was always the intention of kind of citizen journalists to some degree. What I think we're facing today is, the definition of what a journalist is and who is a political commentator. Where you can have YouTube channels that amass 5 million subscribers that actually beat CNN or MSNBC on a nightly basis because of this dedication that certain individuals have to a narrative. One thing I found kind of unique about this particular moment is if you look in the context of vigilante violence in the 19th century, with some exceptions, a number of people preferred to do these activities anonymously at night. Whereas what we saw on January 6th was live streaming, people showing their faces, shouting for the heads of congressional representatives, this arrogance on the part of kind of the militant right-wing, predominantly white crowd at the January 6th riots, who were also bolstered by this kind of new wave of what you might call pseudo journalists that represent the new media, or the alternative media as it's usually called, via the internet. So it's not even just the event itself, but the aftermath and the repercussions of it. But the one point that I want to make to build upon something Todd said earlier is that if you compare what we saw as far as police preparation for January 6th, to just a few months earlier in the summer when Black Lives Matter was initiating protests across the country, you will see a very different picture of the type of preparation that was involved to meet the Black Lives Matter protesters. Whereas on January 6th, you saw guards that were wearing what is the usual attire that they would have on any other day. The Capitol, maybe a few other forces were invited to join. But in the summer protests with Black Lives Matter, the preparation was military police surrounding the Capitol, despite the fact that protest was predominantly peaceful. So you see that how race is impacting the political narratives, as Todd had mentioned, and that was very much invested in the historical narratives of US history. So with that, I'll hand that over.
Okay, Dr. Shaw.
Yeah, thank you much. I'm glad that Dr. Parry interjected that because I think that segues to your question, Catherine, about the strength of democratic institutions, and I think, quite frankly, that democratic institutions are the rigidity of democratic institutions are being revealed now in key ways. the very fact that in this nation, and I'll just go off on a limb here, but the very fact in this nation that that it has taken us so long to have some level of a guarantee right to vote. And it is still a matter of very much vested in what states do. And so one citizen, one person, one vote in theory, but in some respects, it depends very much upon if you can navigate the laws of one state versus another. Now, why would that? What does that speak to? Well, that speaks to the ability of individuals to make a case about why, in fact, there was a steal, right? Americans aren't clear about the Electoral College. It's confusing a bit. And so, yeah, it's in theory, I guess it's possible it could have been stolen. Well, in theory, it makes no sense because it's all the same ballot. Again, I'm somewhat referencing President Biden's comments. But, you know, that's just sort of one aspect of the relative rigidity or the problems of our democratic institutions. And the fact that they don't, and sort of, sometimes it's the incremental nature of American politics, that the problem is immediate, and yet by our constitutional system, it takes a while for certain things to be addressed. And then that simply permits individuals to say, well, why don't we, in effect, elect individuals who can make a forceful case about immediate change? Why don't we invest our faith in autocrats who can speak to these concerns? And so anyway, I mean, I'm just sort of making a passing reference. I do think that these institutions are under assault. I think that if you look, even if you looked at this notion of American exceptionalism, Americans are more divided than any other constitutional democracy, according to survey results. We have wider gulfs among Americans on is the nation more divided as a result of the pandemic and as of January 6th, or as a result of what happened on January 6th. Does that reveal it? Yes. So in some respects, we have to rethink and think about these institutions, political parties as well, to ask ourselves the question, are they really meeting the moment? And are they reflecting majority and sentiment, or are they very anti-democratic? I'm going on a limb, but why not?
Good. Do either of you historians have a reflection on the idea that there's a gulf between our civic populace in the U.S., and if it's a new gulf or an expanded gulf of what's already has always been in place? And when we think about trying to address that gulf, as you know, we had the Civil War, and there was an attempt to put the nation back together, for good or ill. How do we see the political effort to pull the nation together, the educational effort, possibly through civic education, to create a end to this gulf? Who are the players in trying to fix the gulf, and what do they need to do?
So I think one interesting way to look at this is to once again invoke the legacy of Reconstruction here. Except I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. Of course, I think many of our listeners are aware of the idea of there being multiple reconstructions in U.S. history. Of course, we have the Reconstruction period right after the Civil War. Many historians and even activists at the time referred to the Civil Rights Movement as the second Reconstruction. And in the last few years, you've had folks who refer to the Obama years as the third Reconstruction in some ways. Others would argue we're still going through that right now. What is notable about each Reconstruction period is that it was followed by a much longer period of backlash, of what we would consider right-wing backlash, of the politics of white grievance, concerned about the rise of multiracial democracy. And so I think what you're looking at with these civic institutions is that during both the first and second Reconstruction, so civic institutions were in many ways expanded. They were enlarged to include more types of Americans. You can see this in the first Reconstruction with, of course, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments added to the Constitution, and the expanded idea of a multiracial polity that could vote in national, state, and local elections. Of course, you see this cemented in the second Reconstruction with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and also the Immigration Act of 1965. We kind of forget about that one too. And then, of course, in third Reconstruction, you see the creation and the sustaining of this Obama coalition that is multiracial, vibrant, and so forth. But after those periods of democratic renewal, we saw periods of considerable white backlash that I think with January 6th being linked very much to those events. Now, to Dr. Shaw's point about the civic institutions, what we saw with the first two Reconstructions is that those civic institutions, again, were expanded upon. They allowed more people access to them. I mean, consider that in 1870, 71, in South Carolina, you had numerous Black political leaders in the state. You had Black politicians going to Washington, D.C. for the first time in history. During the second Reconstruction, you had an explosion of Black participation in Southern politics that we hadn't seen since the first Reconstruction. But I think now what we're seeing is that these civic institutions, they are, shall we say, a bit creaky. They're a bit leaky. They aren't quite as ironclad as we thought. And I think part of that was we took them for granted for so long. And part of it is we need a leadership that recognizes the problems we're facing right now, that is a leadership that is in both parties. And I think that's a big part of the problem, is that that's not really the case anymore. The civic institutions aren't going to be effective unless both parties recognize their importance and recognize their utility.
Great, thank you. Now I want to remind the audience that we are open for questions. So if you have anything that you would like to ask any of our panel, please go ahead and drop your question in the chat or in the Q&A. Okay, any follow-up thoughts on the role of civic organizations in addressing this this gap that we have from either of you?
Well, go ahead, Dr. Parry.
Oh, well, I was just going to note that I don't know if this directly answers the question, but I think it builds upon the general ideas that from a historical perspective, there has always been a concerted effort to manipulate what you would call either the white working class vote or the white poor vote. And the idea here is that Trump kind of reflects this faux populism that is attractive to people, despite the fact that his campaign had very little substance outside of insulting the opposition in many ways. Because I think if you ask the average Trump supporter, what do you really have against Joe Biden's platform? Like, what is he offering that you just don't like? Because from my estimation, the expansion of social services could deeply benefit a lot of white communities that are facing kind of economic problems. Factories are moving out of the areas that many of them belong to. Cutting something like Medicaid could be deeply hurtful and impactful for many of them. And if Joe Biden's platform is to expand social services, to invest money into the economy, to help all people, what is the essential problem with that? But what we've seen historically is that the manipulation and the faux populism of the right has been utilized to elevate kind of personalities to the forefront of the presidency and other governmental positions, to where it seems that there's an attachment to the fact that if the body politics expanded, if more people are allowed the rights to vote, if votes are not suppressed, that the predominantly white conservative party has something to lose from that. And so I found this kind of interesting that January 6th in many ways represents a culmination of everything that I think historians and political scientists have known for a long time. But this was maybe the first time that it was just so deeply ingrained in the media to where people could actually see how violent and how catastrophic this type of problem could be if it's not taken care of in advance.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw.
Yeah, and I want to respond to the question about civic institutions because again, me listening to Dr. Greene and Dr. Parry reminded me of some key things here. One of which is if we go back to this period of Reconstruction, there's also those sets of works that speak about when we use the term civic institutions, or I should say, use the civil society, those aspects of life that are not themselves explicitly political, but they engage people in politics. So, one aspect of that story about Reconstruction, particularly from the African-American freedom movement, are the ways that African-Americans communities came together, whether it be churches, civic groups, etc., or budding civic groups, to demand rights, to have community discourse, to argue, well, what in fact should you use that vote for? There's work by Hazel Carby, among others, who would talk about this notion that even when African American women didn't have the vote, prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment, in effect do I have that correct? I should know as a political scientist. But that in effect, these women would make a case to African-American men of how will you use our vote in the community. I make that point because I think part of this story will be about the reform of American institutions. The democratic institutions have always been about social and political movements. The civil rights movement we can certainly think about and has already been referenced. You would not have the 1964 Civil Rights Act, 1965 Voting Rights Act without the civil rights movement. It's inconceivable. It's not that it wouldn't have happened, but we know what the movement was indispensable to it occurring when it did. And I think there are, to Dr. Parry's point, there are movements and counter movements, right? And so the question now is, what is the January 6th counter movement? To what degree are Americans asking the question in all of these ways? Our democratic institutions matter. The access to the ballot matters. The belief in the rule of law matters. And in what ways can these, is there any possibility, I'll ask that, for such a set of questions to be able to reach across aspects of these deep political, racial, and political and party divides? Don't know. But again, I guess that's my reference to the sort of the civil society is that the strength of the democratic institutions will depend in part upon political and social movements that continue to press these questions about the health of American democracy.
Well, that's actually a good point, Dr. Shaw, because I have been surfing the net a little bit and peeping in on what some of the young people are saying. And there was one conversation I saw that said, I don't know if this January 6th question is worth all of this time and attention. And I think it's kind of a distraction from the fact that we hadn't had the voting rights bills passed. We hadn't had some of the other policy pieces that were promised to us passed. And in addition, it doesn't seem like there's much movement of the January 6th commission, just a bunch of hot air. So maybe this whole thing is just a big distraction from from these other issues. So how do we connect to people who are saying, oh, well, this is just a, kind of a distraction. We really need to be talking about other issues.
Well, my brief immediate response just very quickly is you fundamentally have to understand the nature of the problem to address it. If we have some segment of Americans directed by a former president believe fundamentally misbelieving a untruth, a lie, that they are willing to perpetrate violence against sitting members of Congress, we've got a problem that is not going to go away. Now, I understand that young person's frustration to say, well, what the heck am I going to do about that problem? I completely understand. But I would say we are not going to, I think this is connected. The same individuals who may be who do not believe that we should make use of these vaccines, who do not believe we should not mask, who do not believe that we should expand access to healthcare, who don't believe there's a whole bevy of things that will line up in opposition to these things that would promote the well-being of communities. It's not a unrelated, or it correlates with sort of these political identities that say if in fact, or they correlate with those who may be supportive of one political ideology and one political party, right? And so, I don't want folk to be disparaged by it, but the scholar and citizen in me says we should address it. We should raise it. Now, to raise it is then to have a public discourse about what is next, and why certain things aren't moving through Congress, and because you have such a small Democratic margin and no Republicans voting for pieces of legislation, when in fact aspects of these bills would benefit their states and their districts. So that is it's not a unrelated problem. It's a broad evidence of the broader, or it's a symptom of the broader problem of which these things are all connected. Although again, I understand the young person's frustration.
Agreed. Now I want to also ask Dr. Parry and Dr. Greene if there is something in your new book that would give people some kind of sustenance for this discussion.
What a great question. So in a word, yes. So the volume is specifically about the University of South Carolina, but to students who attend that university, or really any university throughout the country, one thing that becomes very obvious and clear is how much the higher ed institution is connected to broader state politics or national politics. So what we found when we looked at the University of South Carolina specifically is how much the institution was tied to the broader politics that were occurring throughout the state at every single time frame that was studied. So particularly in the chapters that look at Reconstruction, I contributed one, as well as faculty members at the university as well. And also there's a chapter by Brian Robinson that is very much invested in the state politics in regards to the institution. Is that one thing becomes very clear to me the more that I engaged the volume and served as its editor, is that if you simply allow yourself to be convinced that something appears to be a distraction and that becomes less valuable to study simply because you perceive that there are more important things to do, that's when the narrative becomes captured by the opposition. because there are many who are not going to stop talking about January 6th. And the reason why they're going to is because they're going to downplay the impact. They're going to try to convince everybody else that it doesn't matter and that there are other things that you could be doing with your time. And this is very much a reflection of what happened when the university was trying to be desegregated at that time. There was this notion that this was a distraction or that this was an evil takeover, and that the expansion of people who were able to attend the university was dangerous to the white body politic. And then what Todd also mentioned earlier about how the efforts of African-American women during the Reconstruction period were so important, despite the fact that the vote was not yet extended to them. You have individuals throughout the state of South Carolina, one named Celia Dow Saxon, who essentially educated thousands of African-American children throughout the 50 plus years that she was involved in the public schools. And so I just think that if we don't have these types of events on the forefront of our minds as we're talking about the impact that it has upon society as a whole, we do ourselves and future students a disservice for not being able to understand fully why it is important to keep this narrative going. And I think the chapters within the volume, and Robert can certainly speak to this more, reflect how important it is to continuously engage in types of events.
And yeah, I think relating to both Dr. Parry's point and also the question you raised earlier, Catherine, about why does this all matter? Why should we might be concerned with it? In the book that we put out, there are a few chapters that deal with the long fight to desegregate USC in the 20th century, and secondly, how going back to one of Dr. Parry's early points about commemoration on campus, right? And how the campus has built and constructed and, dare I say, reconstructed its own memory, its own history throughout the last few years. Now, the chapter that I wrote for the volume, which is chapter 6, which is about efforts to segregate the school before 1963. One of the things that I found doing research for that chapter was that the state NAACP, the civil rights organizations, they all had different ideas for why they wanted to push desegregate USC. I think most people think of the civil rights era and desegregation as every Black activist having the exact same desire, having the exact same focus, and that could not be further from the truth. When in the 1940s, they were pushing to desegregate the law school at USC, and they were offered the choice of, well, we can either just close down a law school and make it equal for everyone, or we can build a separate law school at SC State. Many Black activists said, you know what, we'll take a law school at SC State because we don't have any other good options, and it is a Black-run institution that we can at least have some control over. Likewise, when we think of efforts to push for civil rights in the 50s and 60s in South Carolina and across the country, we should again reflect upon the fact that Black activists had different strategies, different ideas for what they wanted society to look like, all built around what they were dealing with at that particular time. And I think this relates also to Dr. Shaw's point about how the events of January 6th have to be understood in their full context. Because after all, this is not just an event of historical importance. This is an event whose outcome, whose destiny, we still don't fully know yet. The events are still having effects on us as we speak, and so we have to be careful to understand what happened on that day. And finally, to Parry's point, and going back to the book for just another quick second, how we think about the history of these events is incredibly important. I mean, again, the last chapter of the book, written by Kat Allen and Lydia Brandt, does a great job of looking at how different historians, different authors have looked at USC's own history, especially on race, and they've come to very different conclusions. We cannot assume for 1 second that the narrative over January 6th will be easily built. We cannot assume for 1 second that everyone will accept a certain narrative of events. This is going to be something that's going to take generations of scholars and activists alike working towards to say January 6th mattered for these reasons. Because if we don't do that, January 6th may matter for an entirely different set of reasons that some of us may not be comfortable with.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. And I want to go to Dr. Shaw and ask you the same question. In your book, After Obama, African American Politics in the Post-Obama Era, is there something there or some points there that people would find useful in trying to understand this phenomenon of January 6th and where we can go from here?
I had a feeling you were gonna ask if my scholarship has any relevance to politics, which is a fair question, more than a fair question. So yeah, in that book we tried to. It's an edited volume, and we tried to. I and my co-editors try with our many contributors who we're grateful for, lay out a fairly comprehensive view about the impact that Barack Obama, at least from our estimation, may have on the, or what way his legacy will have an impact upon African American politics. One aspect of his legacy is certainly the degree to which Barack Obama demonstrated the proposition in this nation that, in fact, is it conceivable that the nation can elect a person of color, in this case, an African-American man, to be president of the United States, and race still not matter? Well, we're all quite clear that race still matters. And Obama even said in his closing address as president, that in effect, we are not in a post-racial era by any stretch. I'm sure if he was pressed to say this. And in some respects, we can say that Obama's presidency, as important and significant as it was in many respects, did not as fundamentally change the trajectory of American politics as some might have hoped it would. In some ways, yes, it is true that now his vice president is now president of the United States, but one set of it's not simply a problematic conclusion to think that, well, is it conceivable that Donald Trump was a reaction to Barack Obama? In some ways, that is true as well, and that's why I refer back to the congressman's comments against the president at that time, because these are some things that preceded Trump in some ways. The roots of Trump preceded Trump, quite frankly. So, what I hope that folk might glean from our book is that in some ways the jury is still out. That it is quite conceivable to elect someone to a high office, and to use the biblical quote that Derek Bell famously used in his work, and yet we are not saved, and yet we are still not where we would hope to be, where we could be in that dream of a multiracial democracy that at least extends back to Reconstruction.
Thank you so much for those insights. We are closing in on the final minutes of our time together. So I would like to invite each of you to give us, in a minute or two, the best advice for doing what's necessary to reclaim and capture and preserve the America that we want in the face of this event on January 6th. Start again with Dr. Greene.
Yeah, I would just urge everyone, and again, thank you so much for having me be part of this panel this afternoon. I think this has been a great conversation. What I would say very quickly is that, number one, we need more conversations like this across the country. We need more people to interact and engage with scholars, with activists, and most importantly, with each other, so that we can really get to the root causes of this, of what happened January 6th, so that we can avoid it again in the future. But more than that, we need to be willing to study American history and study it warts and all, because if we want to create the kind of country we really want, if we want to get to what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. referred to as the beloved community, then we're going to have to start by telling the truth to ourselves. I know that President Biden mentioned that in his remarks this morning, that we need to tell the truth about the country. That means telling the truth about uncomfortable facts about our nation's history. But it also means being forthright about the fact that the country can still change. We're always in pursuit of a more perfect union. There's no shame in saying that. But January 6th also taught us that that pursuit can be a very perilous one. So we all have to work together to make sure we can create the kind of country we want.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Parry.
Yeah, no, I'll just build on that really quickly in that, you know, as an educator, left-leaning professor who teaches a variety of different students every single semester, the one thing that seems to reach people is obviously this idea of investigating the history in an honest and objective way. But the one tactic that seems to work is, well, actually, there's a couple of things. On the one hand, introducing primary sources into classes does a significant wonder for opening students' eyes to the reality of the past, because I think that a number of students come into history courses believing that everyone has a narrative and that you should be suspicious of what anybody tells you, which is not a terrible way to think about reading history, but at the same time, it disallows them to objectively look at a text written by a secondary author. But if you introduce primary sources, if you perhaps show them a document from the Reconstruction era, or you show them the Voting Rights Act in the mid-1960s, and then have them compare it to a contemporary document, it is kind of amazing how, when you allow the analysis to flow, how that can actually change people. And then the other thing is that, just as we've talked about kind of the rise of alternative media sources via the internet, scholars also have that at their disposal. There's a number of resources in the digital era. Dr. Greene and I both write for Black Perspectives. I used to edit the blog for a little while. He's now the senior editor. These types of resources are available. And so you really have to find a community of scholars that are invested in digital humanities that can introduce these sources into the classroom, because it's not just the right wing overtaking the internet, though it does often appear that way if you listen to certain media sources. There are a number of people who are doing real work in the digital space to ensure that accurate history is reflected and that it can be accessed very easily by those who are interested in. So it's just a matter of ensuring that the history is honestly told and allowing students to engage with the reality of the history through the primary sources.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Parry. And finally, Dr. Shaw, last words.
Well, I want to again thank you for this invitation to engage in this tough but necessary conversation. And Americans these days, we're having a lot of tough, very difficult conversations. And I completely understand that in the midst of a pandemic, when individuals are worrying about life, limb, and their loved ones, that yet one more bit of news, and to even reflect on really bad news from a year ago, is trying, is emotionally trying. I think, however, in sober moments when we can, I connect my comments to my colleagues here about the value of these discussions. And I would say, even at a grassroots level, in having difficult conversations during the coffee table discussions or dinner table discussions or Thanksgiving discussions, when we can safely gather, that the importance that we have to convey as Americans, American democracy will also matter to the degree we can create American community, the degree to which we have some sense of empathy, even when folk are bitterly and viscerally divided, to kind of understand the nature of that divide, but then to also, community means to create trust. And so the degree to which we can speak about the creation of greater bonds of trust among Americans, and that, for instance, that they can have tough dialogues about race or other things. And there are, and I'll certainly connect folk to the work being done on racial dialogues within communities. That has been a work going on for quite a while, stemming in part, of course, from various movements, including the civil rights movement. But these are the tough things that we have to do for January 6th not to be repeated, is to think about how we lessen this divide, not completely close political differences of ideology, of course not, but to not make it so visceral that the other side is the enemy, and that the other side holds no value. That will be corrosive to our society and to our shared vision of a more perfect union. And we should do something about it in whatever we do.
Well, with that, I would like to once again thank Dr. Robert Greene with Claflin University, Dr. Tyler Parry with the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Dr. Todd Shaw, University of South Carolina, Dr. Parry and Dr. Greene, the co-editors of Invisible No More, the African-American Experience at the University of South Carolina, and Dr. Todd Shaw, After Obama, the African-American Politics in a Post-Obama Era. So I thank you so much for a wonderful conversation, and one that I think will help us through this day and through the rest of the upcoming 2020 election year and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much.